pro-Trump nationalist candidate has won Poland's presidential election in a shock result for the country. In a very close race, Conservative Karol Nawrocki defeated the Liberal mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski. So, what does this mean for Poland's political future? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Robyn Dwyer. A new Conservative president, Karol Nawrocki, has been elected in Poland by a narrow margin. It's a blow for Prime Minister Donald Tusk, whose favoured candidate came second and who will now face further challenges passing domestic bills due to the president's veto power. So, who is Karol Nawrocki and what does his election mean for Poland?
A wave of red and white swept across Warsaw. Karol Nawrocki's victory keeps Conservative leadership in the presidential palace. He beat Liberal Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski by less than 2 points, one of the tightest races in Poland's history. The 42-year-old Conservative, who was once a historian and amateur boxer, will take over as Poland's president. He's built his image as a nationalist, skeptical of deeper EU ties, and an ally of US President Donald Trump. And although supportive of Ukraine, he doesn't want them to join NATO. Trump congratulated Nawrocki on social media. Nawrocki quickly responded, thanking Trump and saying a strong alliance with the US would be one of his top priorities. This election wasn't just choosing the president. It was a vote for Poland's future direction. East or West, sovereignty or integration. And Nawrocki's election now deepens the clash between the president and prime minister. The president holds veto power, so he can reject laws passed by parliament. That's a major difficulty for Prime Minister Tusk, who has already struggled to push reforms with previous president Andrzej Duda.
If he were to show willingness to cooperate, that would be a positive surprise. If not, there's no point in waiting. We will start working regardless of the circumstances.
In response to the result, Tusk has called for a vote of confidence to reaffirm support for his pro-EU government. But analysts warn Nawrocki's victory could further polarize Polish politics and make governing even harder.
So let's meet our guests. And joining us from Warsaw in Poland is Marek, who's CEO of the Economic Freedom Foundation. In Brighton, we have Aleks Szczerbiak, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex. And here with me in the studio is journalist and broadcaster Nina dos Santos. Welcome to you all. Great to have you with us. So I want to start with you, Marek. And this was a surprise result, wasn't it? You're in Poland, you're in Warsaw. What's the mood like?
In Warsaw, it was for sure surprise because majority of voters from Warsaw voted for mayor of the city, Rafał Trzaskowski. Also, you have to understand that Poland is very divided, so there are many parts of Poland when this result was expected. I participated in the election night in one of the bars in Warsaw, a lot of very liberal young people, and they were cheering at 9 p.m. And then after 2 hours, when late polls were published, there was this dramatic change of the mood. But Poland is very divided, so of course it was a surprise, but I think it was also expected because many opinion polls were showing that both candidates are very close to each other. We have substantial population of Poland living out of big cities where support for conservative candidates is much higher. So I wouldn't say it was a huge surprise, but I think it shows still high level of polarization of Poland and divisions in terms of values that people share.
And Aleks, Marek talked about the division that this represents. This was a very close race, wasn't it?
That's right. And as Marek says, it shows that Poland is very divided, but also very polarized. I mean, there are very radical differences between socio-demographic groups, less well-off, less well-educated, people who live in rural areas, small towns tended to vote for Mr. Nawrocki. The other better off voters, better educated voters living in larger towns voted for Mr. Trzaskowski. Also difference in terms of the kind of social values that were held. Nawrocki voters much more socially conservative, much more religious. Trzaskowski voters much less religious, much more socially liberal. But also, importantly, there are some real differences about how people view the nature of the state and the kind of elites and institutions that have emerged in post-1989 Poland. Mr. Nawrocki's supporters are much more suspicious, much more wary about the elites and institutions of the Polish Third Republic, whereas supporters of Mr. Trzaskowski tend to be much more embedded within the business and cultural and indeed the political elites.
And Nina, you recently interviewed, didn't you, the man who came a very close second in this race. What did you make of him?
Rafał Trzaskowski is a very accomplished politician, it has to be said. I interviewed him as part of a panel of EU mayors that represented parties that were, broadly speaking, aligned with Ursula von der Leyen and Brussels, so centre-right, but also some liberal parties as well. And he made a very compelling argument for how he viewed his party had steered Poland towards a stronger position inside Europe and also a stronger economic footing, and Warsaw was the centre of that. But we also have to remember that world affairs have helped to shape Poland's place on the map like never before, because there's a hot war on the other side of the border over in Ukraine. And I think probably there will be quite a few people in Brussels who will have been quite shocked by, as you were just saying before, Aleks, the slither, wafer-thin margin that he lost by. And he, in fact, used his speech after his initial victory speech, by the way, when the first exit polls appeared to show that he had won and he conceded defeat, he used that to essentially say, look, Karol Nawrocki, I'm going to hold the fire to your feet here to remind you that this is a very, very slim margin of victory that you have. So he's a very erudite politician, he's a polyglot, but he's also viewed as a Brussels insider, or at least somebody who's a stooge for a Brussels insider, some of his nemesis might say. And there will, of course, be people who don't espouse to that view of Poland.
And, Aleks, a lot of people are voting in this election. I wonder how important Poles living outside of the country were in determining the result.
Well, there was a record number of Poles who registered to vote in the election and turned out to vote. In a very closely fought race, which this was, people thought that they might actually end up making the difference. In particular, the Trzaskowski camp was hoping that that they would this would tip the balance in their favour. As it happened, although Trzaskowski won, it wasn't by the kind of margin that he would have hoped to have won in order to overturn the advantage that Mr. Nawrocki had among Poles voting in Poland. And also we should remember that it's very differentiated in terms of, you know, what the Polish diaspora is. In Western Europe, for example, most Poles tended to vote for Mr. Trzaskowski, and whereas in the United States, most Poles tended to vote for Mr. Nawrocki. The other thing we should remember is that a lot of Poles vote for lots of Poles voted for the third-party candidates who dropped out after the first round. And a lot of these were not necessarily Trzaskowski voters. They were people that would have voted against Mr. Trzaskowski, as we saw the voters of the candidate who finished third, Sławomir Mencen, the radical right candidate, overwhelmingly went for Mr. Nawrocki. So although obviously there were a very significant turnout from diaspora Poles, much higher than in previous elections, in the end, this didn't tip the balance as some commentators thought it would, and Mr. Trzaskowski and his campaign hoped it would.
So, Nina, Mr. Nawrocki's background came in for some scrutiny in the run-up to this vote, didn't it? His alleged associations and behaviour. That doesn't seem to have bothered voters, though.
No, but I think in some ways it has sort of energised a certain macho faction on the right, as we just heard there from Aleks before. You saw that with the Polish vote, the Polish diaspora over in the United States. Partly he was also backed by Donald Trump, who really made the effort to see him before this presidential election, which gave him the real MAGA stamp of approval. And so in the scheme of sort of nationalism, that really is the ultimate thumbs up pun very much intended. And it's an optical factor that he used very keenly in this election. Essentially, he was able to market himself to Polish voters, particularly those who liked his politics, who were sympathetic with the law and justice's agenda in previous governments, to say, look, I can continue this 15-year stint of presidential domination by the Law and Justice Party, and I've got the backing of the US President of the United States, the strongest macho character in the world of politics these days, on my side. And as you said, you know, for many politicians, having had a background in street brawls, football hooliganism, and then also, interestingly enough, having been a historian and not an economist at a time like this, when Poland's economy might well get hit by Donald Trump's trade tariffs imposed on the EU, you'd have thought that's quite a quixotic mixture, really, for somebody to take the helm of an important country like Poland. But obviously, there are quite a few people who like that ideal, that identity in Poland, and they voted in big numbers for him, just not big enough for it to be a big majority. That's the important point.
So Mr Nawrocki, pro-Trump, self-declared, actually met President Trump in the Oval Office. Do you think, Marek, that this US-Poland relationship is going to be an important one?
I think for sure, yes. Nevertheless, I'm not so sure how important the meeting was, because there are also opinion polls showing that actually because of Donald Trump's policies, his unpredictability, there was deterioration of positive emotions of polls towards the United States. Nevertheless, I think the US is still a very important ally of Poland. We are members of NATO. We have the war on our east invasion of Russia on Ukraine. So this relation is important, and I think President Nawrocki can be a useful link between Poland and the US. What is also important is that Polish right, in comparison to some other right-wing parties in Europe, is as anti-Kremlin and anti-Russian as Polish center-left. So there is, I think, this unity that we should be very serious about threats from Russia, and we should support Ukraine in winning this war.
So, Aleks, Ukraine was a factor in this election, wasn't it? What do you think this result means for that relationship and for Ukrainians?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the president doesn't have formal foreign policy competencies. It's the government that makes foreign policy. Although the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and also nominates ambassadors, for at the moment he's not ratifying the government's ambassadorial appointment to the United States. So there are some formal competencies there, but much more important is the fact that the president has a huge mandate and therefore can insert themselves in foreign policy debates. When it comes to Ukraine, I mean, as Marek said, there's an overwhelming consensus within Poland that the country should continue to provide military and diplomatic support to Ukraine, and Mr Nawrocki strongly supports this. However, one of the things that he has emphasized is that where Polish and Ukrainian interests clash, Poland needs to be much more assertive about standing up for its interests. For example, on things like historical questions, the massacre of Poles by Ukrainian nationalists in the Second World War, which Poland doesn't feel that Ukraine has come to terms with. It considers this a genocide. Economic issues like Polish farmers who feel that they're being undercut by unfair competition from Ukrainian farmers. Mr. Nawrocki will argue, and is arguing, that Poland needs to be much more instrumental, much more transactional, and leverage the fact that Ukraine really does depend on Poland as an important hub for military and humanitarian aid, and indeed for diplomatic support, to assert its interests much more aggressively, much more clearly, and in those areas where Polish and Ukrainian interests clash. And this will put some pressure on the government. Also, it's worth noting Mr. Nawrocki is very sceptical about Ukraine joining NATO, which has led some of its critics to argue that he's echoing Mr. Putin's narrative. On the other hand, it's very difficult to present him as a Russophile because Moscow actually has an arrest warrant out against Mr. Nawrocki. He's simply got a much more transactional and much more instrumental approach to Polish-Ukrainian relations than we've seen up until now.
So, Nina, this result rather repositions Poland, doesn't it, within Europe. How do you think its relationship will be now with Poland?
Well, I think some quarters of Brussels will have tensed quite a bit when they saw this outcome, particularly given the fact that Poland was one of those key pillars that the new incoming German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has been advocating Europe position in a much, much more important position, not just because it is essentially the front line of NATO and the EU with regards to the Russian aggression on Ukraine, but also because it's where, as your previous guest had just pointed out, there's a lot of military hardware that's being positioned. The EU is trying to beef up its defences and get its EU members to spend quite heavily, but Poland is the example of that, spending more than towards 4.5% of its GDP on military hardware. Has to be said, a lot of that not European, a lot of that also American, hence the importance of that Polish-US relationship. Poland has, has a trade deficit with the United States, so it's not the naughty step from Donald Trump's point of view there either. But Emmanuel Macron of France, Friedrich Merz of Germany were expecting Warsaw to be this sort of important third pillar of a new EU security and economic axis forming. And I suppose the question now is, given this result, is Donald Tusk's coalition going to be weakened? Will he be a lamed-up prime minister for the next few years until there are more parliamentary elections in a couple of years? And how will that affect Poland's newfound importance at the top table of the decision-making process in Brussels, Berlin and Paris?
So that's Poland's foreign relations, if you like. But what about back at home? Marek, this was seen, wasn't it, as something of a referendum on Donald Tusk's months in power. Is he to blame for this result?
I think it's not Donald Tusk should not be blamed. I think the problem is with the whole governing coalition. There were very huge expectations after 2023 elections regarding policies, regarding topics like the rule of law, regarding consequences for some politicians of law and justice that broke law, and nothing really big happened after the elections. Sometimes we heard that they can't proceed with some legislation because president could veto this legislation, but they rarely tested President Duda with these laws. So, of course, this was referendum on the support. It is why it was quite difficult for Trzaskowski to win, because the government is less popular today than it was when it was elected in 2023. But what is also important regarding the position of president is that we had and we still have president from Law and Justice Party. So from international perspective, it's still not a big difference. We'll still have like the veto power by the president, but we still have Polish constitution, which says that foreign policy is led by the government. So if Karol Nawrocki decides to follow this part of the Polish constitution, then I think there shouldn't be any big shifts in terms of real foreign policy. There might be shift in communication, as it was mentioned regarding, for example, Ukraine and some kind of demands for Ukraine to do something for Poland as well, but also in terms of anti-EU rhetoric, in terms of over-regulation or policies towards agricultural sector or green policies. Here we may hear a lot of tweets and press conferences by President of Poland, but in fact, he does not have strong powers to interfere in foreign affairs at the political level.
And Aleks, Marek there saying he doesn't have strong powers to interfere, but he does have a presidential veto, doesn't he? What does that mean for Donald Tusk and his programme of reforms that he wants to carry out in Poland?
Well, what it means is that the government can't get its legislative programme through if the president decides to veto it, because it doesn't have the 3/5 majority in parliament required to overturn a presidential veto. It's also worth noting, incidentally, that the president can refer legislation to a very powerful body called the Constitutional Tribunal under a method called preventative control, which actually stops that legislation from coming into effect until the Constitutional Tribunal has considered it. So that is also a very significant power that the president has. And this will be felt in a number of areas. I think that, some areas, the government didn't pass legislation simply because it, didn't get its act together. It wasn't able to agree among themselves on moral, cultural issues like liberalising the abortion law, which a lot of people voted for this government expecting it to implement. They simply haven't been able to get the legislation through Parliament or even agree amongst themselves legislation. I think the key area where this will make a difference is the ability to unravel the judicial reforms introduced by the previous Law and Justice government. There are about 2,500 judges in Poland that were appointed after those reforms were introduced in 2018. The current government doesn't recognise those judges. This is most of the Supreme Court in Poland are what the current government calls neo-judges and doesn't accept them as legitimate. However, attempts to introduce legislation to remove them or to demote them were blocked by Mr. Duda. He nominates judges, and he made it clear that any legislation that undermined their legitimacy he would not support. Had the election gone the other way, the government would have been able to fulfill this process of undoing these judicial reforms. With Mr. Nawrocki as president, it has no chance of doing this, basically. So this is a key area where the government has said that they wanted to institute deep institutional reform, but because of the presidential veto, they won't be able to do this.
So, Nina, this looks like a difficult set of circumstances for Donald Tusk, doesn't it? Somebody from the opposing party effectively having a veto over everything he wants to do. He's already called for a vote of confidence in his own government. Do you think he can survive this? Can the government survive this?
Well, if you look at the example of Emmanuel Macron over in France, things can get quite nasty when people suddenly decide to, announce votes of no confidence after moments like this. I suppose the question is would his coalition be fatally weakened if he didn't? And would it collapse anyhow? I suppose Poland is in an interesting predicament because, I hate to point out, it's stuck between two Donalds, isn't it? The pressure of the MAGA movement over in the United States. This is an example where, unlike Romania, Canada, Australia, we haven't seen entirely that backlash against Donald Trump's belligerence on the world stage, certainly economically, backfire. It has, to a certain extent, helped in Poland. And what it's done is it's clipped the wings of the Prime Minister, Donald Tusk. Whether or not he may manage to grow back those feathers that have been clipped with his vote of no confidence, I don't know. But you can imagine that the drama in Brussels will be watched very, very keenly because of Poland's crucial position in the world right now. And that security dynamic over in Ukraine isn't changing anytime soon. The economic dynamic coming from the United States with those trade tariffs still under fierce negotiation between Brussels and Washington, D.C. is not changing anytime soon. And the stability that the EU and the trading relationship of places like China and the US have brought Poland has been significant under the last couple of years of Donald Tusk's time. It's just people in some parts of the country feel that they haven't felt the benefit of what they view as global elitism. And that's a popular argument elsewhere around the world too.
So, Marek, the next presidential election due in 5 years' time. So where does this leave Poland? It's been doing well economically, has a more central role up until this point in the EU. Where do you think Poland will be at the time of this next presidential election?
I think first that many great things related to Polish successful economic story happened not thanks to politics or policies, but despite some, politics or problems with over-regulation. So it is the basis of the Polish success. Polish entrepreneurs, hardworking people, and sometimes we overrate the impact of politicians on doing business or economic growth. Nevertheless, I hope we can still be this positive story of the European Union because we were growing very fast while many countries, especially in the Western Europe, had problems with economic growth. To accomplish this, we need to do a lot of things domestically. There is this process of deregulation now in Poland, initiated by Prime Minister Tusk in February. I don't see any reason why President Nawrocki should block this deregulation. But I think because a lot of Polish legislation depends on the EU, there is also a big question about the EU competitiveness and what will be the role of Polish government and Polish president to some extent to impact these reforms at the EU level. There is also the question of how huge security spendings will be used also to boost economy. Poland is spending almost 5% of GDP on security or military expenditures. There is question how Polish entrepreneurs, European companies can benefit from this expenditure so that we also use it to stimulate our growth. So I think economy will be very important. I think also economy is important for elections of the results. 2023 was just after the period of very high inflation, which was not good for law and justice government. Now there is kind of not great situation, but also not terrible. I think some people had higher expectations, and we'll look how the new government whether the current government and the new president will be able to keep Poland on this positive track of successful example of growing country and catching up with the rest of the West Europe.
Marek, Tatala, Aleks, Szczerbiak and Nina dos Santos, thank you all very much for coming on the programme today. Great to talk to you. And that's it from this edition of Roundtable. And do remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.